Hi, my name is Rich. Some of you might already be familiar with me from TikTok and Instagram, but today I am here to bring you the first video in my brand new Metal 101 course. In this first video, we're going to be looking at scales, the fundamental building blocks behind most Western contemporary music. We're going to be looking at what scales are most commonly used within the metal genre and subgenres, how they're applied, what makes those scales sound the way they do, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be a little bit more informed on the scales that you'll find frequently used throughout metal and its subgenres, and know how that you can apply them to write your own metal riffs. So first and foremost, what is metal music? So metal music is a subgenre or denomination of rock and roll. It was popularized by bands like Black Sabbath in the early 70s, who coined the term heavy metal to describe the sound of their guitars that were likened to the sound of crashing heavy metal hitting together. It's characterized by fast shredding guitar solos, pounding drums, intense, more than often non-melodic vocals, and of course, heavy distorted guitars. Since its inception in the 1970s, metal music has evolved and grown into its own standalone genre. With it, every new generation of musicians have tried to push boundaries and explore the further reaches of what they can do with their instruments, whether it be fast shredding solos, thrashy frantic riffing, or doom-laden atmospheric guitar playing. Metal musicians are constantly pushing the boundaries of what they can do on their instrument. But the one thing that all of these iterations have in common is they all sound evil and heavy. So that begs the question, what exactly is it that guitarists are doing in the metal scene that makes them sound so much more aggressive than, say, rock or any other form of music? And that's what we're going to explore in this video today. In this video, I'm going to be going through 4 of the most commonly used scales in metal. With each example, I'm going to be giving you an in-depth, thorough breakdown of the theory behind that scale, about what makes that scale sound the way it does. We're going to be looking at the chords you can build from it. We're going to be looking at the intervals used in that scale, the structure of the scale itself. And with each scale, I'm going to be giving you an example of that scale used in a song. In that little example, I'm going to be breaking down the theory behind the riff and talk about how to play it, what they're doing from a theoretical standpoint, and some little songwriting and compositional tips that you can take away from it to apply to your own metal writing. The 4 scales we're going to be looking at in this video are the natural minor scale, the harmonic minor scale, the Phrygian Dominant Scale, and the diminished scale. Before we go any further, it's worth pointing this out. There's going to be a lot of music theory talk in this video, and you're going to need a basic understanding of at least the major scale. The major scale forms the backbone of all the music we listen to and all the scales we derive from it. So you're going to need at least a basic understanding of that scale. If you're a little bit unsure, you can check out my video that I did on major and minor scales. For example, in this video, if I talk about flattened thirds or flattened sixths, I'm referring to the note, the third and the sixth from a major scale being flattened by 1 semitone. So the minor scale forms the backbone of pretty much any sad or melancholic sounding music that we hear, not just in metal music, but across the board in any genre. It's one of the most popular scales used in music, and it's been used by bands like Black Sabbath back when they were laying the foundations of heavy metal music, right back in the 70s, up until modern day bands like Killswitch Engage and Architects, and even bands like Slipknot using it in the heavier end of the spectrum of heavy metal. It's a super simple scale to play and remember, and a great sounding one at that, because at its very core, the minor scale sounds sad and melancholic, which is 2 great foundations to build your metal music on. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the intervallic structure of this scale. We're going to be looking at the distance between the notes of the scale and the sounds that they make. So all of this is going to be comparing it to a major scale. So like I said, make sure you've got that understanding of the major scale nailed. So this is the intervallic structure of our minor scale. So we're going to start on our root note. Then we're going to move up to our second. Then our flat third. Then our perfect fourth. Our perfect fifth next. Then our flattened sixth, our flattened 7th, which will then take us back to our root note again, an octave up. So let's just break down what all of that meant. So there are 3 specific notes within the minor scale that give the minor scale its sad and melancholic sound. And those notes were the notes that you heard me say were flattened, which were our 3rd, our 6th, and our 7th. So that's our flat 3rd right there. That's our flattened 6th. And that's our flat 7th right there. What I'm referring to when I talk about flattened notes is moving those notes from the major scale down, flattening them by 1 semitone. So when it comes to songwriting, if we want to give our songs that specific natural minor kind of feel, it's the flattened 3rd, the flattened 6th, and the flattened 7th intervals that we're going to want to play on more to accentuate that kind of natural minor sound, because those are the notes that are specific to this scale. The flattened 3rd and the flattened 7th degree are 2 really commonly used notes in metal music. The reason being is because they're so closely related to the root note. So when using these to write riffs, people can play on these notes to give the impression of the root note of a scale, and then that minor sound either side of it, with the minor 3rd and the minor 7th, both resolving back to the root note in some capacity. It really just drills home that kind of minor sound, and as well as centralizes the tonal center of the song based around that root note of the key. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at the structure of this scale when compared to a major key. So between our root note and our 2nd note, we're going to be moving a whole tone, which is like jumping over a whole fret. Between our 2nd and our flat 3rd, we move a semitone. Between our flat 3rd and our perfect 4th, we move a whole tone. Between our perfect 4th and perfect 5th, we move a whole tone. Between our perfect 5th and flat 6th, we move a semitone. And between our flat 6th and flat 7th, we move another whole tone. And then we move one last tone back to our root note. So the structure of our minor scale is tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. So the movements between these notes bring to mind a whole host of examples of riffs used in the metal music scene. Not only that, if we were to build chords based on each of these degrees of the scale, it brings to mind even more common chord progressions using the minor scale. So if I was to build a chord on each degree of those scales, it'd sound something like this. We'd have a minor first chord, a diminished 2nd chord, a major 3rd chord, a minor 4th chord, a minor 5th chord, a major 6th chord, a major 7th chord, taking us back to our root chord. A really common chord progression using the minor scale that really accentuates that minor feel is the chord progression of a major 6th, a major 7th, and a minor 1st. It sounds a little bit like this. You would have heard that kind of chord progression through many modern metal tracks from Killswitch Engage, As I Lay Dying, and Architects, just to name a few that have used those specific chords to build a chorus, for example. So now we've explored the intervallic structure, the structure and the chordal structure of this scale, as well as the defining characteristics. I'm going to show you how this scale has been used in an existing song. The song that we're going to focus on is Granite by the band Sleep Token. The riff goes a little bit like this. So first and foremost, let's have a little look at how to play this song. It's played in the tuning of B standard or drop B. Doesn't matter which one, because all we're going to be using to play it is our low B string. So we're going to start on the 5th fret, and then do a quick run of the 5th fret, the 7th fret, and the 8th fret. And then we're going to jump up to our 12th fret and slide down to our open note. And then strike the 3rd fret, sliding up to the 10th fret. From there, we're going to play the 10th fret and then the 7th fret. Back to our open note. Sliding from our 12th fret down to our 3rd fret and then up to our 10th fret. So that's the frets. That's how that riff is played. But let's have a look at what's going on from a musical theory side. So we're starting on the 4th degree of our B minor scale. And we're moving from the 4th to the 5th to the 6th. Now that there is the first clear indicator that we are playing in a minor key, that tone then semitone kind of movement. It's very reminiscent of the beginning few notes of a minor key. In fact, if you were to drop into this song and listen just from there, you'd think that was the beginning of the scale. It's not until we hear our next note that we're given a little bit of context as to where we are in the scale. We jump up to the higher octave note of our root note and then slide back down to the bottom root note. The addition of those notes gives us a little bit more context about where we're on the scale and what notes we're actually playing at the moment. So whereas originally it sounded like we were playing our root, 2nd and 3rd note, we now know from this 4th note that we hear that we're in fact playing the 4th, 5th and 6th with our root note being that low B. So we've got this little ascending melody of the 4th, 5th and flat 6th, moving up to our high root note in the upper octave and then sliding back down to our low root note in the lower octave. Then we jump up to our minor 3rd, our flattened 3rd. And then a real big movement back up to the flattened 7th degree just before our octave root note. Down to our perfect 5th. And then back to our root note at the low end of the octave, sliding from the higher octave down to our flattened 3rd and back up to our flattened 7th. So what we have is this great display of building tension through little melodies using a few notes of the minor scale. There's a lot of movement. We're not just ascending, we're not just descending, we're doing something called scale sequencing and using a lot of back and forth movements within this scale to create the riff itself. Almost every single note in the scale is used, but there's a strong emphasis on those notes like the flattened 3rd, the flattened 6th, and the flat 7th, with those being some of the most commonly used notes in that scale. The constant reiteration of those notes is what makes this scale sound so minor. All in all, it's a great example of a minor scale riff. Fun and simplistic, while still retaining that minor feel and a very heavy delivery. So that's all we've got to say about the minor scale. So just a few key points to recap. The minor scale is sad and melancholic sounding. It is defined by its flattened 3rd, flattened 6th, and flattened 7th intervals, and you will find it used across the board in all genres and subgenres of metal music. So the second scale we're going to look at in this video is the harmonic minor scale, and it sounds a little bit like this. So the harmonic minor scale was originally used by classical composers such as Beethoven, Mozart and Schubert, but in more recent years has been used by guitarists such as Yngwie Malmsteen, Randy Rhoads and Chuck Schuldiner, lending to metal music a little touch of gothic neoclassicism. So as metal music has progressed, the harmonic minor scale has been used more and more and found itself shuffling into some of these new denominations and subgenres of metal music, becoming a cornerstone foundation of that specific sound. You'll find it frequently used in heavy but melodic subgenres of metal, such as melodic death metal, black metal, and modern day music deathcore. So first of all, let's have a little look at the intervallic structure of this scale. So we start on our root note, then to our second, moving up to our flat third, then our perfect fourth, our perfect fifth, our flat sixth, our normal seventh, and back to our root note. So I'm sure you heard it, there was a great similarity between the majority of that scale and our natural minor scale that we heard a little bit earlier on. But the defining characteristic of this scale specifically is that kind of major seventh sound we have right at the end of the scale. It's like we've got a natural minor scale, but with a major seventh sound at the very, very end. So I'm sure you heard it as well. What we have is a natural minor scale with a very, very different sounding ending. What we've basically got is all the defining characteristics of a minor scale, but with a major seventh sounding ending. What that means is the usual flat seventh that we have at the back end of our natural minor scale has been raised to the sound of a normal seventh degree that we get in a major scale, which is where we get that little bit of neoclassicism and that real leading note that pushes us back into our root note. So let's have a look at how that affects our scale structurally speaking. Starting from our root note, we're going to move a full tone again to our second note. From our second to our flat third, we move a semitone. From our flat third to our perfect fourth, we move a whole tone. From our perfect fourth to perfect fifth, we move a whole tone. From our fifth to our flat sixth, we move a semitone. And from our flattened sixth to our raised seventh degree, our normal major seventh degree, we move a tone and a half. And then moving back to our root note, we move a semitone. So the structure of this scale is tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone and a half, or tone and a semitone, and then a semitone to finish it off. So it's a huge jump from our flattened sixth note to our now raised seventh degree, back to that major seventh kind of sound at the end of the scale, but only a little semitone jump compared to the tone jump that we had in our natural minor scale from our seventh note back to our root note. It's that little semitone push that gives that little bit more expectancy to resolve back to our root note, and that's why we call it a leading note, because it leads back in to the root note. But it's not just the structure of the scale and the intervals that have changed with the addition of this major seventh note. Every aspect of this scale has been altered. For example, if we were to build chords again on each degree of the scale, we'd have a very different layout. So building chords on each degree of the scale gives us a minor first chord, a diminished second chord, an augmented third chord, a minor fourth chord, a major fifth chord, a major sixth chord, a diminished seventh chord, and back to our root minor chord. So we can see that just changing that one note from our flattened 7th sound back to our normal major 7th sound at the end of the harmonic minor scale has affected a load of the chords in our scale. Let's just have a little look as to why. That third chord, which was originally a major chord in our natural minor scale, now becomes an augmented chord. The reason being is the 7th degree of our scale is used in that chord. Because it's raising up, it creates a raised 5th degree of that chord, which is what gives us that augmented sound. The same can be found when we look at the 5th chord of our scale. In a normal minor scale, the 5th chord is a minor chord. But once again, that raised 7th degree of our scale is used within that chord. And by raising that note up in that chord, it creates a major sound instead for our 5th chord. And finally, the 7th degree of our scale has become a diminished chord again, because what would normally be a major chord has had the root note shifted up a semitone, because it's the 7th degree of our scale, causing a diminished kind of sound that pushes us back into our root chord so beautifully. So that's a little bit of information about what makes the harmonic minor scale sound the way it does. We've got a minor scale, but with a major 7th sound at the end, leading back into our root note. And we've also got a couple of chords, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th chord, changing because of that raised note. So now you know a bit about the harmonic minor scale. Let me give you an example of it in a riff. This is a song by a band called At the Gates. It's called Cold. It goes a little bit like this. So that was how that riff sounds. Let's have a little look at how it's played. Once again, we are playing in B standard. So we're going to be starting on our E string, which is our 2nd string down. We do that 3 times before moving to the 9th fret, once, the 10th fret, twice, and then back to the 9th fret for one more repetition. Then we're going to slide back up our neck to our 2nd and 3rd fret and do a very quick hammer on and pull off motion between the 2nd and 3rd fret, going back to the 2nd fret at the end. And then slide up to our 6th fret on our E string and play that repeated pattern again of the 6th fret, permeated by a few open B chugs on the low string. We do that 4 times, then we move back up to our 10th fret and repeat that pattern again twice more, and then on the 9th fret for 2 more times before we return back to the beginning. So the second time through, we're going to play this riff exactly the same, starting 7th fret on our E string, moving up to our 9th, our 10th, and back to our 9th, sliding all the way down and doing our hammer on and pull off motion on our 2nd and 3rd fret, then moving back up to our 6th fret, all the while using that bottom B string as a pedal note. But instead of jumping to the 10th fret and then the 9th fret to finish it off, we're going to create an octave shape on the 10th fret, strum that twice, and chuck in 3 very quick palm muted bottom B notes, then recreate the same octave shape on the 9th fret and finish it off with 3 more palm muted B notes. So that's how you play this riff. Now let's have a little look at what's going on from a theoretical standpoint. So we're playing in B harmonic minor, obviously, and we're going to be playing the melody of this riff in our upper octave while using our bottom root note in the lower octave as a pedal note. We start on our root note, moving up from our root to our 2nd to our flattened 3rd before coming back to our 2nd at the very first phrase. Then we slide down into our lower octave and we're using the 5th and 6th notes for that little hammer on and pull off section up here. Then we move up to our major 7th sound, that raised 7th degree of our harmonic minor scale, and we repeat that pattern again there. Before jumping up to our flattened 3rd again in the upper octave, down to our 2nd degree, then back to our root note. Second time through, it's all exactly the same. We're starting on our root, moving it to our second, our flat third, back to our second, down into our lower octave, and alternating between the 5th and 6th, flat 6th degrees, then up to our raised 7th degree again, and this time just constructing octave intervals on our flattened third and our second degree to finish off the riff. So once again, just like the previous example, what we have is a scale sequencing pattern moving up and down the harmonic minor scale. We're not just simply moving up, higher and higher ascending, and we're not just simply moving down. There's a certain degree of ascending before we move down, descending in the other direction, and then jumping back up again. It makes that scale sound a little bit more interesting than just simply moving in one direction. The main difference between what we did last time and what we're doing with this riff is that we're using that bottom note, that bottom B, as a pedal note, that constant reiteration of the root note to bring home that tonal center, whereas the melody is carried in the upper octave of the guitar's register. Once again, almost every single note of the scale is used. There's a strong emphasis on the flattened third, a very quick use of the flattened 6th, and then a strong emphasis on that sharpened 7th degree. So once again, we're taking the notes that make the harmonic minor scale sound like the harmonic minor, and we're pushing it into the listener's ear to make sure that we reiterate the fact that we are playing in B harmonic minor. So that's the riff for you, and here's just a few notes to recap about the harmonic minor scale. It's neoclassical and Gothic in nature. It's defined by its flattened third, flattened 6th, and its major 7th intervals, and you'll find it commonly used in melodic death metal, black metal, and deathcore. So that's our second scale. Now let's move on to our third scale, which is the Phrygian Dominant Scale. So our third scale in this video is something a little bit different to the previous two. As a guitarist, you've probably heard the word mode thrown around, but if you're anything like I was a few years ago, you don't know what a mode is. So allow me to first of all break this down for you so you can understand it. A mode is a scale not starting on our root note. What that means is if I was to play C major, but rather than starting on our root note of C, I used our second note, D, as the root note, and then played through the octave from D to D, that would be a mode, providing I kept with the notes of C major. So instead of playing C major starting on C, but instead of starting on the root note of C, I started on the second degree of the scale, D, and moved through all the notes of C major, stopping on the octave of D, one octave up. That would be a mode. For each degree of a scale, there is a mode you can build on that degree of the scale, each with their own defining characteristics and sounds, much like minor scales and major scales. Modes sound a little bit different to our standard and major and minor scales because the tonal center has shifted. What that means is that our ears are picking up different intervals and different sounds because we're listening to a scale, one that we're familiar with, from a different point. So we're hearing lots of different pulls and movements from what we normally do. All the places our ear is normally drawn to and all the places we expect there to be a resolve are no longer there because the resolutions that we would normally hear aren't being played in the same places. The Phrygian Dominant Scale that I'm playing now is a mode of the harmonic minor scale. So if I was to play the harmonic minor scale that we heard in our last example, and I was to play it from the 5th degree up to the 5th degree in the next octave, I would be playing the Phrygian Dominant Scale. So the Phrygian Dominant Mode or scale brings with it a really exotic kind of sound. Chances are if you've been to the cinemas to see a film and a scene was set in the Middle East, this is the music that's usually used to write for that scene. So a lot of people associate it with a very kind of exotic and different kind of sound. And obviously, anything that's a little bit different fits perfectly into metal and all its many subgenres. So this mode or scale is used throughout metal and all its associated subgenres. Depending on which artist or which subgenre you're listening to, probably depends on which elements of this scale they use to their advantage, but you will find it used especially in the more harsh sounding subgenres like death metal and thrash metal. So let's start off by breaking down the intervallic structure of this scale. So we're starting off on our root note. We're moving to a flattened second, and then up to a normal major third degree. Up to our perfect fourth, our perfect fifth, our flattened sixth, our flat seventh, and then back to our root note. So straight away we're hearing how different the front end of this scale sounds compared to our natural minor or harmonic minor scales. This is a minor scale that's not defined by a flattened third or a minor third interval. This is a scale that's defined by its flattened second interval and its major third interval. That interval between our root note and our flat second was popularized by the theme tune to Jaws by Steven Spielberg. Never before have two notes been used to create such an ominous sense of dread. And it's that sound right at the forefront of our scale that gives this scale a very different but clear minor feel. Unconventionally, we also have a major third interval between our root note and our normal third degree. Whereas we still have in the latter half of the scale a flattened sixth and a flattened seventh degree of our scale. Let's have a look at how this affects the structure of our scale. So we're starting on our root note and moving a semitone to our flat second. We're moving a tone and a half or a tone and a semitone to our major third, a semitone to our fourth, a tone to our fifth, a semitone to our flat sixth, a tone to our flat seven, and a tone back to our root note. So the structure of our scale is a semitone, a tone and a half, or a tone and a semitone, a semitone, a tone, a semitone, a tone, and a tone back to our root note. So we've got these huge and interesting intervals between our notes in this scale, but there's more to it than that. If we were to build chords on each degree of our scale, we'd hear some really interesting movements, most notably the first two chords of this scale. As we said before, this scale is defined by its flattened second and its major third interval at the front half of the scale. But if we were to build chords on the first two degrees of the scale, we'd have a minor scale with two major chords at the very beginning. So our chord layout is like this. So we've got a major first chord, a major second chord, a diminished third chord, a minor fourth chord, a diminished fifth chord, an augmented sixth chord, and a minor seventh chord, before taking us back to our major root chord. So that's our E Phrygian dominant riff. Let's break that down and see how it's played. So we're starting on our A string on our 7th fret, building a power chord shape. And then we're following that with two little palm mutes of our bottom E string. and then a sliding motion, taking our power chord up to our 8th fret on the A string, and then moving it back down to the 7th fret. So that'll be followed by a power chord shape on our 5th fret, moving up to our 7th fret, then 8th fret, and then going back down to our 7th and 5th fret before pulling back to our root note on the 7th fret on the A string. And then that's followed by a series of palm muted opens afterwards. So the next bit sees us move a little bit higher. We're going to start on our 7th fret on our A string again with our power chord shape and do a couple of palm muted E strings afterwards. Then up to our 12th fret, building a power chord shape there, moving that shape down to the 11th fret, then all the way down to the 8th fret, the 7th fret, and then the 5th fret. And then the riff repeats again. Straight back into our starting point on the 7th fret, moving to the 8th fret. So that's how you play this riff, but let's have a look at what's going on from a music theory standpoint. So we're playing in the key of E Phrygian Dominant. So we're starting on an E note, the 7th fret on our A string, and building a power chord shape there. And what we're doing is using that bottom E string as a pedal note again, just like in the last example. Then we're moving up to our flat second and alternating between that flat second and our root note. The second little run that we do takes us down to our minor 7th, our flat 7th degree, moving up to our root note, pushing up to our flat second again, and then moving in the other direction, going back to our root note, back to our flat 7th, and back to our root note. The section where we move to the higher frets, we're moving from our root note all the way up to our perfect 4th, shuffling down one semitone onto our major 3rd interval, down to our flat 2nd, then our root note, and back to our flattened 7th degree before the riff starts again. So as I said before, just like our previous example, we're using our bottom E string as a pedal note to reinforce the tonal center of this scale as E and E Phrygian Dominant. The notes that we're using in this scale all scream E Phrygian Dominant. We're emphasizing the use of that flattened 2nd, that flattened 7th, and our major 3rd interval. So all the key notes that give us that Phrygian Dominant sound at the front of our scale, we're making sure we use in this riff. What we're also doing is using something called constant structure, which is where we take one single shape and move it around the fretboard. In this instance, we're using a power chord shape, and we're moving that around different degrees of the scale. Although our ears recognize this as playing in key, we actually break out of key just a little bit when we move from the 4th to the 3rd. In reality, the notes that we play on our 3rd degree of our scale should sound a little bit like this. That's because the 3rd degree of our scale in the Phrygian Dominant mode is a diminished chord, which means we've got a flattened 5th in there and give us that very dissonant sounding chord. But because we're using constant structure and we're moving this power chord shape around the fretboard, we build a normal power chord shape on that fret instead. So even though the middle note of that power chord technically isn't in key, our ears are registering it as so because we're moving along the root notes of our Phrygian Dominant scale. So in this riff, we're seeing a lot of uses of flat 2nds, flat 7ths, and major 3rd intervals to reinforce that Phrygian sound. It's a super heavy, super chunky riff, made all the more heavy with the power chord shapes coupled with the Phrygian Dominant sound. And that's Phrygian Dominant. So some of the key things to recap here are it's exotic sounding, it's defined by its flat 2nd and a major 3rd interval, as well as our flat 6th and flat 7th. And you'll find it used primarily in genres such as death metal and thrash, but you will find it in other genres as well. And that takes us on to our final scale of the video, and arguably the most unmusical sounding scale we're going to look at, and that's the diminished scale. It sounds a little bit like this.
So as you could tell from that little example then, this is by far the most dissonant and harshest sounding scale we're going to be looking at. Whereas our natural minor scale sounded pretty sad and melancholic, our harmonic minor scale sounded neoclassical and gothic, and our Phrygian dominant sounded ominous and exotic, the diminished scale, quite frankly, sounds horrible. But it's meant to. You'll frequently find it used in jazz, and because of its dissonant and unharmonic sound, you'll find it used in much more extreme subgenres of metal, such as death metal, mathcore, and so on. The other interesting thing about this scale is that it's comprised of 8 notes rather than 7. The natural minor scale, the harmonic minor scale, and the Phrygian dominant scale all have 7 notes, with the 8th note taking us back to our root note in the upper octave. Whereas the diminished scale is comprised of 8 notes, with the 9th note being a return to the root note in the next octave, making it an octatonic scale. The other interesting thing about this scale is it's constructed with symmetrical movements of whole tones and semitones, rather than a mixture of the two sporadically used throughout like the previous scales. Due to its unusual and harsh sounding nature, it's really difficult to use this scale to write an entire song, so it's best saved for those particularly heavy sections where you really want to emphasize dissonance and a lack of harmony, which is why it's so well suited for those more extreme metal subgenres. Let's have a look at the intervallic structure of this scale. So we're going to start on our root note, moving to our second, then our flat third, up to a perfect fourth, then a flattened fifth, up to our flattened sixth. We're also going to have a natural sixth in there as well, a normal natural seventh, and then our root note at the end. So there's a lot to unpack there. We've got elements of both the major and the minor scale, and some degrees of the scale that are exclusive to the diminished scale. So we've got the second and the fourth, which we'll find in both the major and the minor scale. But we've also got the flattened third and the flattened sixth degree of the minor scale. That's our flattened third. And that's our flattened sixth. But contrastingly, we've also got the major seventh and major sixth of our major scale. That's that major sixth, and that's that major seventh. Against the intervals we have from the minor scale, they sound really, really unusual and quite uncomfortable, which is what gives the diminished scale its unusual and harsh sound. We've also got something called a flattened fifth, whereas all our previous scales have used a perfect fifth interval between its root note and its fifth note. We're flattening our fifth degree by 1 semitone, which creates what we call a tritone sound. The tritone back in medieval days was called the devil's chord because of how uncomfortable and dissonant it sounded. What it means is it's an interval of 3 whole tones between a root note and another note. And if we count out whole tone measures between our root note and our flattened fifth, we get a tritone. And on that note, let's have a look at the structure of this scale. So from our root to our second note, we're moving a whole tone, then a semitone, then another whole tone, then a semitone, another whole tone, another semitone, one more whole tone, and one more semitone. So that structure is tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, back to our root note. So as I mentioned previously, this scale is comprised of a symmetrical pattern of tones and semitones, which is what throws our ears off when we're listening to it and why it sounds so uncomfortable. Adding to the already dissonant sounding tritone we find in the middle of that scale, what we also have is a repeated interval of minor thirds between certain notes. We have a minor third interval between our root note and our flattened third, and a minor third interval between our flattened fifth and our major sixth. Coupling these two intervals together creates for a really unpleasant sound, which is why it's perfect for the aforementioned genres we've mentioned. So now you've heard how the diminished scale sounds and you've learned a bit about it, let's show you how you can use this in the context of a song. The example I'm going to be giving you is from a particularly heavy band called Thy Art Is Murder, and the song is called Soldiers of Immortality. It goes a little bit like this. So that's the riff, really dissonant, fast and frantic. So let's break down how it's played. We're playing it on a 7-string guitar for this one in drop A, or just a 6-string in drop A. And you're going to start on your 2nd string, your E string, on the 7th fret. And we're going to hammer on from our 7th fret to our 10th fret. Then we're going to shuffle up 1 fret and 1 string and move to our next A string and play the 8th fret, hammering on to the 11th fret. Then back to our first movement of the 7th fret to the 10th fret on our E string. Back to our second movement of the 8th fret and the 11th fret on the A string. And then move up another string and another fret to the 9th fret on our D string, hammering onto the 12th fret. Then back down to our 8th fret on the A string, hammering onto our 11. And then back to our root note, 7 on the E string, hammering on to our 10th fret. And then finally moving back to our 8th fret on our A string, hammering on to the 11th fret. The pattern then repeats again for the first 6 movements, taking us back to our A string, 8th fret to 11th fret hammer on. But instead of moving back down to the E string and playing the 7th fret again, we're going to move back up to our D string, playing the 9th fret, hammering on to the 12th. And then move to the G string, 10th fret, hammering on to the 13th. And that's the riff. So that's how you play it, but let's break down what's happening from a theoretical point of view. So we're starting on the root note of an E diminished scale, and we're hammering on to our minor third. We're moving up to our flattened fifth on the next string, hammering on to our major sixth. Then we're moving back to our root note again, repeating the first movement. Back to our flattened fifth. And then back to our octave on the next string, recreating the first movement that we made, but an octave up. It carries on repeating these movements throughout the riff until the second half of the second repetition, where we recreate the movement of the flattened fifth, hammering on to the major sixth, up an octave again. So in reality, there's not really a lot going on there. All we're doing is using the same motion of hammering onto a minor third above a chosen note and moving along from our root note up to our flattened fifth, to our octave of the root note, to the octave of the flattened fifth, and just alternating between those. So it's not really a lot, but what we're doing is reinforcing that tritone sound across 2 octaves. In addition, we're also coupling in those minor third hammer-ons every single note that we play. So a very diminished kind of feel. We're taking the 2 most dissonant intervals we can get, minor thirds and tritones, and coupling them together to reinforce this diminished kind of feel. Those constant minor third intervals sit really uncomfortably with most listeners because as consumers of music, we've been conditioned to get used to major third and minor third intervals varying in our music. That constant static minor third interval really drives home that diminished feel and gives a really unsettling feel to our listeners, especially as it moves across the tritone notes. In addition, it takes so few notes to get that diminished kind of feel. In reality, we've only played 4 notes spread across 2 different octaves. So it really reinforces how much the diminished scale relies on symmetrical shapes and patterns. So that's the diminished scale, the most uncomfortable sounding scale we've gone through. A couple of things to quickly recap. It's a horrible, dissonant sounding scale defined by a flattened third, a flattened fifth, both a flattened and a major sixth, and a natural 7th note. It's 8 notes long, which is most uncommon, and you'll find it heard in particularly brutal and experimental styles of music such as death metal or mathcore. So there you have it, 4 of the most commonly used scales in metal. The sad and melancholic sounding natural minor, the neoclassical and gothic sounding harmonic minor, the exotic and ominous sounding Phrygian dominant, and the horrible and dissonant sounding diminished scale. All 4 scales used across the board in metal through a variety of different subgenres. We've broken down how and why each scale sounds the way they do and seen an example of each scale used in a riff, and we've seen some fantastic applications of how to use it in a riff through the means of pedal notes, scale sequencing, constant structure, and repeated patterns and motifs. But there's still so much more we can do with these scales, and so much more we can do with scales in metal music. First and foremost, there's no law saying these 4 scales are the only ones you can use to write metal music. The wonderful thing about a genre like metal and all its affiliated subgenres is it's so boundary pushing. The sky is truly the limit. So you can use whatever scales you want to harness the sound that you want, even if it's something like the blues scale or the major scale. In addition, there's plenty of examples of multiple scales being used in one song, so don't feel that you've got to write your song based around just one scale. You might have a chord progression that works in natural minor, but a main riff that works in Phrygian dominant, and there's nothing stopping you from making the 2 flow together seamlessly. In addition, you can also use chromaticism, the use of all 12 notes that we use in Western music, to get your desired effect, whether it be through simple passing notes in your riffs, or a completely chromatic sounding riff by throwing all theory out the window and simply relying on what sounds heavy. So that's it for the first video in my Metal 101 course. We've looked at 4 of the most commonly used scales in metal and how and why they sound the way they do. If you've watched this video and it's not made 100% sense to you, don't worry. Make sure you recap on all the videos we've done on our major and minor scales before coming back to this video. And make sure you understand this video completely before we move on to video 2, where we'll be looking at applying scales to our riff writing and using scale sequencing, pedal notes, constant structure, repeating melodies and motifs, and phrasing to develop your metal riffs further.